Picture this. The year is 520 BCE. A 10-year-old boy named Darius stands trembling in the grand courtyard of Persepolis, the jewel of the Persian Empire. His small hands are bound with silk rope that cuts into his wrists, despite its softness. Around him tower the massive stone columns carved with winged bulls and lions, symbols of power that will mock him for the rest of his life. The boy doesn't yet understand why he's been brought here, why his father sold him for a handful of silver coins, or why the palace officials keep staring at him with that calculating look in their eyes. What he's about to experience will transform him from an innocent child into something the ancient world considered neither fully man nor woman. Something that existed in the shadows of the most powerful empire on earth, serving kings who commanded millions of subjects across 3 continents. He will become a palace eunuch, and his journey into this hidden world will reveal horrors that make medieval torture chambers look merciful. You think you understand ancient Persia, the mighty empire of Cyrus the Great and Darius the First, the civilization that built roads connecting India to Greece, that created the first declaration of human rights, that ruled from the Mediterranean to the Indus River. The Persians gave us magnificent palaces, advanced mathematics, and sophisticated administrative systems that would influence governance for millennia. But behind the golden facade of Persian civilization lay a darkness so profound that even hardened historians struggle to document it fully, because maintaining an empire that stretched across 3,000 miles required more than just armies and bureaucrats. It required a special class of servants who could be trusted with absolute power while posing no threat to the royal bloodline. Men who had been surgically and psychologically transformed into living tools of imperial control. The Persian Empire didn't invent eunuchs, but they perfected the systematic creation and deployment of castrated men in ways that would shock modern sensibilities. What I'm about to reveal isn't hidden in obscure academic texts or classified archaeological reports. These practices were openly documented by Persian chroniclers, Greek historians, and Roman observers who witnessed them firsthand. The horror isn't that these things happened in secret. The horror is that they happened so routinely, so systematically, that entire bureaucracies developed around the mutilation and exploitation of children. Between 550 and 331 BCE, the Persian Empire operated what can only be described as industrial-scale child procurement networks. Every province was required to provide a quota of boys between the ages of 8 and 12 for palace service. These weren't volunteers or criminals. They were children torn from families, purchased from slave traders, or seized as tribute from conquered territories. The Persian court records, preserved on clay tablets discovered at Persepolis, document the systematic collection of over 40,000 boys during Darius I's reign alone. But selection was just the beginning of their nightmare. The Persian system didn't simply castrate boys and send them to work. They created an elaborate hierarchy of eunuch classes, each requiring different surgical procedures, different training regimens, and different levels of psychological conditioning. The process was designed not just to remove their masculinity, but to completely reconstruct their identity, their capabilities, and their loyalty to the crown. At the lowest level were the harem, general servants whose castration was performed quickly and brutally. These boys faced a survival rate of roughly 30%. Those who lived would spend their lives performing menial tasks, their mutilations serving primarily to ensure they could work around royal women without representing a sexual threat. But even this basic level of eunuch creation involved procedures so horrific that Persian physicians developed specialized medical texts documenting techniques for keeping victims alive through the trauma. Above them were the vizier kadam, administrative eunuchs, who received more sophisticated surgical procedures designed to preserve certain functions while eliminating others. Their training included not just literacy and mathematics, but psychological conditioning that would break their will and reconstruct their personalities around absolute obedience to imperial authority. Persian court records describe training programs lasting up to 7 years, during which these boys were systematically stripped of every aspect of their original identity. At the apex were the Khwaja, the great eunuchs who would eventually wield enormous power within the palace system. Their creation required the most complex surgical procedures, performed by specialist physicians who had perfected techniques for preserving life while achieving maximum psychological impact. These operations were so sophisticated that they influenced surgical practices throughout the ancient world, though the knowledge was gained through the systematic mutilation of thousands of children. The boy Darius, trembling in that courtyard, has been selected for the Khwaja track. The officials examining him aren't just checking his physical condition. They're evaluating his intelligence, his emotional responses, his potential for the complex psychological transformation they're about to inflict upon him. They need to ensure he's smart enough to be useful, but young enough to be completely reshaped by their system. What happens next will determine not just whether he survives the initial surgery, but what kind of creature he becomes afterward. Because Persian eunuch creation wasn't just about removing body parts. It was about creating an entirely new category of human being, one that existed outside normal social structures while possessing intimate access to absolute power. The Persian palace system required eunuchs who could be trusted with state secrets, who could manage harems containing hundreds of women, who could serve as confidential advisors to kings while posing no dynastic threat. This meant creating men who were psychologically incapable of independent action while being intellectually capable of complex decision-making. The contradiction inherent in these requirements led to procedures and training methods that bordered on psychological torture. The initial surgery was performed in specialized chambers deep within the palace complex. These weren't crude procedures carried out by untrained butchers. The Persians had developed surgical techniques sophisticated enough that they influenced medical practices for centuries. But sophistication didn't mean mercy. The procedures were designed to achieve specific psychological effects as much as physical ones. Persian medical texts describe 3 different surgical approaches depending on the intended function of the eunuch. The Gozar method involved complete removal of external genitalia, creating eunuchs who could safely manage royal harems, but would require lifelong medical maintenance. The Tarash technique removed only the testicles, preserving some sexual function while eliminating fertility, creating eunuchs suitable for administrative roles that might require interaction with foreign dignitaries. The most complex procedure, reserved for the highest-ranking eunuchs, involved surgical modifications designed to create specific physical characteristics that would mark their status while preserving their ability to function in complex social situations. But the physical transformation was only the beginning of their ordeal. The psychological conditioning that followed surgery was perhaps even more traumatic than the initial mutilation. Persian palace schools developed systematic methods for breaking down the personalities of young eunuchs and reconstructing them according to imperial specifications. Boys would be isolated from each other and subjected to alternating periods of reward and punishment that had no apparent logic, creating psychological dependency on their handlers. They would be taught that their previous identities had died on the surgical table, that they were now entirely new creatures, whose only purpose was service to the crown. Their original names would be replaced with functional designations that described their roles rather than their individuality. They would be forbidden from speaking their native languages, forced to communicate only in court Persian, using vocabulary that emphasized their servitude. The training included elaborate protocols for every aspect of palace life, from how to walk in the presence of royalty to the precise gestures required when receiving orders. But these weren't just etiquette lessons. They were designed to reinforce the eunuch's psychological conditioning by making every moment of their existence a performance of their servitude. Most disturbing was the deliberate cultivation of emotional dependency. Eunuch trainees were taught to find their only source of validation and meaning through the approval of their superiors. They were rewarded for reporting on each other, creating networks of surveillance and betrayal that ensured none could develop independent loyalties or friendships. Young Darius, recovering from his surgery in a palace infirmary, doesn't yet understand the full scope of what's been done to him. The physical pain is overwhelming, but it will heal. The psychological transformation has only just begun, and it will continue for years, until nothing remains of the frightened boy who entered the palace courtyard. The recovery process itself was designed as another layer of psychological conditioning. Persian physicians understood that trauma creates vulnerability, and they exploited this window of mental fragility to accelerate the breakdown of the boy's original personality. Darius lies on a narrow stone bed in chambers carved deep beneath the palace, where screams cannot reach the surface. The walls are decorated with intricate carvings of Persian nobles in positions of power, a constant reminder of the hierarchy he now serves at the very bottom. His physical healing is monitored not by compassionate healers, but by specialists trained to identify the precise moment when psychological intervention will be most effective. They document everything: his sleep patterns, his emotional responses to pain, his reactions to different types of stimuli. This information feeds into a systematic program designed to exploit his psychological vulnerabilities. The first phase of conditioning begins while he's still bedridden. Palace attendants speak to him only in riddles and contradictions, creating cognitive confusion that makes him dependent on others for basic understanding of his situation. He's told simultaneously that he's been elevated to an honored position and that he's now worth less than the stones beneath his feet. The contradictions are deliberate, designed to fracture his ability to form coherent thoughts about his circumstances. Food becomes a tool of control. Some days he receives elaborate meals fit for nobility. Other days he's given scraps that barely sustain life. The pattern has no logic he can discern, teaching him that his survival depends entirely on forces beyond his understanding or influence. Persian psychological texts describe this technique as breaking the spirit's attachment to predictable reality. But the Persians understood that broken spirits were useless for complex administrative tasks. They needed eunuchs who could think clearly about palace business while being incapable of independent thought about their own circumstances. This required a delicate balance between destruction and reconstruction that Persian palace schools had perfected over generations. As Darius begins to heal physically, his real education commences. He's moved to training chambers where dozens of other boys in various stages of conditioning live in cells, barely large enough for a grown man to lie down. The architecture itself reinforces their powerlessness. Ceilings too low to stand upright, doors that can only be opened from outside, windows placed too high to see through. Everything designed to make them feel small and trapped. The educational curriculum was unlike anything in the ancient world. These boys would learn to read and write in multiple languages, master complex mathematical calculations, understand legal procedures, and memorize interforce their status as tools like at court protocols. But every lesson was designed to reign rather than individuals. They learned languages not to expand their minds, but to better serve masters who might need translation services. They studied mathematics to calculate tribute payments and resource allocations that would strengthen the empire that had mutilated them. Most insidiously, they were taught to take pride in their condition. Persian instructors developed elaborate philosophical justifications for eunuch creation, presenting their mutilation as a form of purification that made them superior to ordinary men. They were told that their sacrifice had elevated them above the crude desires that drove normal males, making them more rational, more trustworthy, more capable of serving higher purposes. This psychological manipulation was supported by carefully orchestrated displays of eunuch power within the palace system. The boys would witness high-ranking eunuchs exercising authority over free men, making decisions that affected thousands of lives, living in luxury that exceeded what most nobles enjoyed. But they were also shown the consequences of disobedience through public punishments of eunuchs who had failed in their duties. The punishment protocols for eunuchs were particularly cruel because they exploited the victim's psychological conditioning. A eunuch who displeased his superiors might be stripped of his palace privileges and forced to live among common servants, experiencing the social rejection that awaited any eunuch outside the protected palace environment. Others faced surgical modifications that would mark them as failures, additional mutilations that served no functional purpose except humiliation. The most feared punishment was expulsion from the palace system entirely. Eunuchs who committed serious infractions would be cast out into a world that had no place for them, unable to marry, have children, or participate in normal masculine social roles. They faced lives of complete isolation and poverty. Persian records document hundreds of former palace eunuchs found dead in the streets of major cities, victims of starvation, violence, or suicide. This threat of expulsion was used to maintain absolute compliance among eunuchs at all levels of the hierarchy. Even the most powerful Khwajasara knew that their authority existed only within the palace walls and could be revoked instantly if they displeased their royal masters. This precariousness was deliberately maintained to ensure that no eunuch could ever feel secure enough to develop independent ambitions. The training also included specialized instruction in reading human behavior and managing interpersonal dynamics. Eunuchs needed to navigate the complex relationships between royal family members, foreign ambassadors, military commanders, and religious authorities. They learned to identify signs of political intrigue, romantic entanglements, and personal rivalries that might affect palace stability. But this knowledge came with strict limitations on how it could be used. Eunuchs were taught to observe everything and report selectively, sharing information that served imperial interests while concealing details that might embarrass their superiors. They became living surveillance devices, their presence in private conversations so routine that people forgot they were listening. Persian intelligence networks relied heavily on eunuch observations, creating detailed records of conversations, relationships, and activities throughout the empire. The psychological conditioning created eunuchs who were intellectually sophisticated but emotionally stunted. They could analyze complex political situations with remarkable clarity, while being incapable of forming genuine emotional attachments to other human beings. Their capacity for empathy had been systematically destroyed and replaced with calculated assessment of how others' emotions could be manipulated to serve imperial purposes. Darius, now several months into his training, begins to exhibit the personality changes the system was designed to produce. He no longer cries at night or asks about his family. His responses to questions become increasingly mechanical, rating his use focused on demonstrativeness rather than expressing his thoughts or feelings. The frightened child is disappearing, replaced by something that resembles a highly intelligent automaton programmed for palace service. But the most sophisticated aspect of Persian eunuch conditioning was how it made victims complicit in perpetuating the system. Advanced eunuchs were given responsibility for training newer recruits, forcing them to inflict on others the same psychological torture they had endured. This created a self-perpetuating cycle of abuse that required minimal oversight from palace authorities. The system produced eunuchs who genuinely believed in their own superiority, while simultaneously accepting their fundamental powerlessness. They took pride in their ability to serve the empire, while knowing they could never truly belong to it. This psychological contradiction created individuals uniquely suited to wielding delegated authority while posing no threat to those who granted it. The Persian Empire's system of eunuch creation reached its horrific peak during the reign of Xerxes I, when palace administrators developed what they called the perfect garden theory. This wasn't metaphorical language. Persian court documents describe human beings as plants that required pruning, grafting, and careful cultivation to produce the desired characteristics. The theory provided scientific justification for increasingly extreme modifications to young eunuchs' bodies and minds. Under this system, boys like Darius faced additional surgical procedures years after their initial castration. Persian physicians had discovered that the human body's development could be manipulated through precisely timed interventions that would alter growth patterns, voice development, and even facial structure. These secondary operations were performed when the boys reached adolescence, ensuring their bodies would develop in ways that marked them permanently as neither male nor female. The procedures were documented in medical papyri that read like instruction manuals for creating monsters. Boys selected for administrative roles would undergo operations designed to preserve their voices at prepubescent pitches, making them sound eternally childlike, even as their bodies aged. Others received treatments that would elongate their limbs and alter their posture, creating the distinctive appearance that marked high-ranking eunuchs throughout the Persian court system. The most disturbing interventions targeted the boys' emotional development. Persian physicians understood that hormones affected not just physical development, but psychological characteristics. They developed chemical treatments derived from various plants and animal extracts that would suppress or enhance different aspects of personality. Boys destined for harem management received treatments designed to eliminate aggressive impulses while preserving intelligence. Those selected for diplomatic roles underwent procedures intended to enhance their ability to read facial expressions and vocal tones while reducing their capacity for emotional attachment. These chemical modifications were administered through food, creating another layer of control over the eunuch's daily existence. Every meal became a potential vehicle for personality adjustment, with different compounds added based on behavioral assessments conducted by palace observers. Boys who showed signs of independence might find their food laced with substances that would increase their docility. Those who seemed too passive would receive treatments designed to enhance their alertness and responsiveness. The Persian court maintained detailed records of these experiments, documenting which treatments produced desired results and which caused unacceptable side effects. The archives at Persepolis contained hundreds of tablets describing the optimal chemical regimens for different types of eunuch service. These records were consulted like cookbooks, with precise measurements and timing instructions for creating specific personality profiles. Darius, now approaching his third year of conditioning, has become unrecognizable from the frightened child who entered the palace. The chemical treatments have altered not just his physical development, but his fundamental relationship with reality. He experiences emotions differently now, feeling them as distant phenomena that happen to his body rather than expressions of his inner self. Joy, sadness, fear, and anger have become academic concepts he can recognize in others, but no longer fully experience himself. His intellectual capabilities, however, have been dramatically enhanced. The Persian system understood that useful eunuchs needed sharp minds, even as their emotional lives were systematically destroyed. Darius can now perform mathematical calculations that would challenge trained scribes, speak fluently in 7 languages, and recite from memory the complete legal codes governing palace administration. But this knowledge exists in his mind, like books on a shelf, accessible for use but disconnected from any personal investment in the information. The training facility where Darius lives has become his entire world. The underground complex stretches for miles beneath Persepolis, containing hundreds of chambers where boys at different stages of conditioning learn their designated roles. The architecture itself reinforces the psychological programming, with corridors that lead nowhere, rooms that change configuration without warning, and passages that require crawling on hands and knees to navigate. Nothing is designed for comfort or logic. Everything serves to reinforce the eunuch's dependence on guidance from their superiors. The dailiest habits. Boys wake at predetermined routine follows patterns so rigid they become unconst times, regardless of how much they eat, identical sleep they've had. Meals at identical intervals. They attend lessons that follow precisely scripted curricula, with no deviation allowed for individual interests or aptitudes. This regimentation serves multiple purposes, creating predictability that reduces anxiety while eliminating opportunities for independent thought or action. But the most insidious aspect of the training is how it creates artificial social hierarchies among the eunuchs themselves. Boys are ranked according to their progress through the conditioning program, with senior trainees granted minor privileges and authority over newcomers. This system ensures that even within their powerless situation, the eunuchs compete for status and validation from the same system that has destroyed their humanity. Darius has achieved mid-level status within this hierarchy, meaning he now participates in the conditioning of newer arrivals. He teaches younger boys the palace protocols he has memorized, administers punishments for infractions, and reports on their psychological development. The Persian system has made him complicit in perpetuating his own abuse, creating psychological bonds that make escape not just physically impossible, but mentally unthinkable. The boys learn to find meaning through their service rankings, rather than through personal relationships or individual accomplishments. A eunuch who demonstrates exceptional skill in record-keeping might be promoted to senior administrative training, bringing prestige within the eunuch community, even as it represents deeper integration into a system designed to exploit him. Success within the palace hierarchy becomes the only form of validation available, creating powerful incentives to excel at serving the empire that has mutilated them. Persian administrators understood that the most effective control systems are those that victims embrace willingly. Rather than relying solely on fear and punishment, They created reward structures that made eunuchs eager to advance within their designated roles. High-ranking eunuchs enjoyed luxurious quarters, fine clothing, elaborate meals, and the satisfaction of wielding authority over thousands of palace servants. These privileges were real and substantial, making the eunuch system attractive, even as it required complete surrender of personal autonomy. The palace complex contained special districts reserved exclusively for eunuch habitation, creating isolated communities where castrated men could live without constant reminders of their difference from normal society. These areas included gardens, libraries, workshops, and recreational facilities that rivaled those available to Persian nobility. Eunuchs could spend entire lifetimes within these districts without encountering the outside world that would reject them. But this isolation served the empire's interests as much as the eunuch's comfort. By creating parallel societies within the palace system, Persian administrators ensured that eunuchs would have no desire to leave, even if escape became possible. The outside world offered them nothing but poverty, discrimination, and social exclusion. The palace offered them purpose, community, and material comfort in exchange for absolute loyalty. The system also created powerful incentives for eunuchs to police each other's behavior. Those who demonstrated exceptional loyalty might be promoted to supervisory roles over other eunuchs, gaining status and authority within their restricted world. But these positions required them to monitor their subordinates for signs of disloyalty or independent thinking, creating networks of surveillance that made rebellion virtually impossible. Persian intelligence services relied heavily on these internal eunuch hierarchies to maintain security throughout the palace system. High-ranking eunuchs commanded networks of informants who reported on conversations, relationships, and activities within their areas of responsibility. This information flowed upward through carefully structured channels, eventually reaching the king himself through reports that could influence imperial policy. The psychological conditioning created eunuchs who were genuinely skilled at reading human behavior and predicting political developments. Their emotional detachment, rather than being a limitation, became a professional advantage that allowed them to analyze situations without being influenced by personal preferences or relationships. They could assess the loyalty of military commanders, the stability of provincial governments, and the reliability of foreign alliances with clinical objectivity. This expertise made them invaluable to Persian rulers who needed accurate information to maintain control over their vast empire. But it also made them dependent on the imperial system for their sense of purpose and identity. A eunuch's analytical skills had no value outside the palace context, where they had been developed and where they could be properly utilized. The Persian Empire created a class of human beings who were simultaneously highly capable and completely powerless, intellectually sophisticated and emotionally stunted, absolutely loyal, and fundamentally disposable. These contradictions weren't accidental flaws in the system, but deliberate features designed to produce servants who could be trusted with enormous responsibilities while posing no threat to imperial authority. Darius, now 15 years old and approaching the final stages of his conditioning, represents the system's ideal product. He possesses encyclopedic knowledge of palace procedures, speaks multiple languages fluently, can perform complex administrative tasks, and demonstrates unwavering loyalty to imperial authority. But he also has no personal relationships, no independent ambitions, and no identity outside his designated role as a palace instrument. The boy who once trembled in the courtyard of Persepolis has been systematically transformed into something that serves the empire's needs perfectly, while existing in a state of permanent psychological exile from normal human experience. He is about to enter the final phase of his training, where he will learn the specific skills required for his assigned position within the palace hierarchy. But even this achievement represents not liberation, but deeper integration into a system designed to exploit him until death. The Persian Empire has created the perfect servant by destroying the person who might have questioned his servitude. What awaits him in the corridors of power will test whether any trace of the original Darius still exists beneath the layers of conditioning, or whether the empire has succeeded in creating exactly what it intended all along. The final phase of Darius's transformation begins in chambers even deeper beneath Persepolis than where his conditioning took place. These are the preparation halls, where eunuchs receive their ultimate assignments and learn the specialized skills required for their designated roles. The architecture here is different, more elaborate, with walls covered in intricate mosaics depicting scenes of Persian imperial glory. But these beautiful decorations serve a sinister purpose, reminding the eunuchs constantly of the power they serve Memphis, whilizing their own insignificance within its grand design. Darius has been selected for assignment to the royal treasury, one of the most covenant hierarchy. The seated positions within the E-role requires managing the empire's vast wealth, coordinating tribute payments from dozens of provinces, and maintaining records of imperial expenditures. The position carries enormous responsibility and considerable privilege, but also represents the final severing of any connection to his humanity. Treasury eunuchs must demonstrate absolute emotional detachment from material wealth, handling fortunes that could purchase entire cities while remaining completely indifferent to personal gain. The training for this role involves exposure to treasures beyond imagination. Darius spends his days surrounded by rooms filled with gold ingots, precious stones, silk tapestries, and artifacts looted from conquered territories across 3 continents. He learns to categorize and evaluate these riches with the same emotional neutrality he might apply to counting grain sacks. The Persian system understands that exposure without ownership creates a unique form of psychological torture, training eunuchs to find meaning in servicing wealth they can never possess. His instructors are senior eunuchs who have served in treasury roles for decades. These men represent what Darius will become, living embodiments of the system's success at creating human calculating machines. They move through the treasure chambers with practiced efficiency, their faces showing no reaction to beauty or rarity that would drive normal men to distraction. They speak in precise, measured tones about valuation methods and inventory procedures, their voices carrying no trace of wonder or desire, despite being surrounded by objects of incredible magnificence. The psychological techniques used in treasury training go beyond simple conditioning. Darius learns to experience wealth through a completely artificial emotional framework, finding satisfaction not in possession, but in perfect organization and accurate record-keeping. He develops genuine excitement about balance sheets and inventory reports, emotional responses that have been redirected from normal human desires into bureaucratic obsessions. The Persian system has discovered how to make mathematical precision feel like personal fulfillment. The training includes elaborate exercises designed to test and reinforce this psychological reconstruction. Darius might be given a handful of precious gems and told to estimate their value, knowing that accuracy will bring praise, while mistakes result in punishment. But the real test isn't mathematical skill. It's demonstrating that he can handle objects worth more than most people earn in a lifetime while feeling nothing but professional interest in their properties. These exercises gradually increase in complexity and duration. Senior trainees might spend entire days cataloging treasures from recent military campaigns, handling artifacts that represent the destruction of entire civilizations. They learn to see these objects purely as administrative challenges, problems to be solved through proper classification and storage. The human stories behind each treasure, the lives destroyed to acquire them, become irrelevant details that don't appear in official records. The Persian treasury system operates on principles of absolute accountability that require eunuchs to develop supernatural attention to detail. Every coin, every jewel, every precious object must be tracked through complex systems that can account for its location and condition at any moment. Mistakes aren't just professional failures, but personal betrayals of the trust placed in them by imperial authority. This pressure creates psychological states where eunuchs find their entire sense of self-worth dependent on maintaining perfect records. Darius excels at this training because his conditioning has prepared him perfectly for finding meaning through service rather than personal achievement. He works 18-hour days, cataloging tribute payments and organizing storage systems, experiencing genuine satisfaction when his calculations balance perfectly, or when he develops more efficient methods for tracking inventory. The Persian system has successfully converted his human need for accomplishment into enthusiasm for bureaucratic precision. But treasury work involves more than just counting coins and organizing storage. Senior treasury eunuchs serve as economic advisors to provincial governors and military commanders, making decisions about resource allocation that can determine the success or failure of imperial policies. They analyze tribute payments to identify provinces that might be planning rebellion, evaluate trade patterns to predict economic instability, and recommend adjustments to taxation policies that maintain imperial revenue while avoiding popular unrest. The Persian Empire fell to Alexander's armies in 331 BCE, but the system they created outlasted their civilization by centuries. Eunuchs trained in Persian methods would serve Byzantine emperors, Islamic caliphs, and Chinese dynasties for over 1,000 years. The techniques for psychological conditioning and human modification developed beneath Persepolis spread across the ancient world, influencing how power structures controlled their most trusted servants. Darius, now a senior treasury official at age 35, never learned what became of the frightened 10-year-old boy who entered the palace courtyard. That child died on an operating table decades ago, replaced by something far more useful to imperial authority. He manages wealth beyond calculation, commands respect from provincial governors, and lives in luxury that exceeds most nobles' dreams. But he remains forever trapped in a body and mind surgically designed to serve others while being incapable of serving himself. The Persian eunuch system represents humanity's most sophisticated attempt at creating the perfect slave, one who embraces his bondage so completely that freedom becomes unthinkable. They succeeded in ways that should terrify us, because the techniques they developed for breaking human will and redirecting human purpose didn't disappear with ancient Persia. They evolved, adapted, and continue influencing how institutions shape individual identity today. The boy who trembled in that courtyard deserved better than becoming a living tool of imperial control. They all did. But their sacrifice built an empire that lasted over 2 centuries and influenced human civilization for millennia. The Persian system proved that human nature itself can be re-engineered through sufficient application of surgical precision, psychological manipulation, and bureaucratic control. Modern readers might comfort themselves believing such systematic dehumanization belongs safely in the past. But the fundamental techniques remain unchanged. Take away someone's identity, replace it with institutional purpose, reward compliance while punishing independence, and create conditions where the victim finds meaning only through serving the system that destroyed them. The methods evolve, but the underlying principles persist wherever power requires perfect servants who can never become rivals. The palace chambers beneath Persepolis are ruins now, their surgical tables cold stone monuments to forgotten horrors. But the echoes of what happened there still resonate through every institution that prioritizes systemic efficiency over individual humanity. The Persian Empire's greatest achievement wasn't its roads or palaces or administrative systems. It was proving that human beings can be systematically transformed into anything power requires them to become. Remember Darius, and remember the 40,000 boys like him, whose names we'll never know. Not as symbols or cautionary tales, but as individuals who deserved the chance to become themselves rather than instruments of someone else's authority. Their suffering built empires, but their humanity was worth more than all the treasures they were trained to count.